Hi everyone, George Lee from South Yorkshire. I'm the Hub PM for South Yorkshire and also work at South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority. I know I'm now keeping everyone from their dinner, so I will try and keep... It doesn't sound interesting, does it, the role of data? Hopefully it will be. My wife will tell you I'm the kind of man who likes to tell you what's wrong with everything. It's one of my endearing character traits. I'm slowly transitioning from an angry young man into a grumpy old man, the kind of heavy metal Victor Meldrew. So I'll hopefully I temper a bit of that professionally by being able to not only think about what's wrong with everything, but how some of that might be improved. So hopefully throughout this section, I'll not only talk about what I think the problem with everything is, but also present some solutions and talk a bit about some of the work that the Hub are doing. I'd also like to credit my colleague as well, Richard Sully, who's here for some of the thinking here, for being a sort of sounding board and helping to ground a lot of my endless moaning into a what are we going to do about it kind of approach as well. So hopefully what I'm going to talk to you about is the role of data. We're going to cover a bit about local area energy planning, and I'm going to introduce what we're calling spatial and temporal modelling and the piece of work that the Hub are doing there as well. So, so what are we doing? How are we doing at the moment? We're all busy, but are we effective? Are the disparate things that we're engaged in doing going to deliver net zero? Do we understand what else we're trying to achieve at the same time? Because net zero or a climate emergency isn't necessarily an endpoint in itself. It's one of the measures of success, but it's not the only one. So how do we make the right choices and how do we bring people with us? It's fair to say there maybe isn't a perfect solution here. There's different trade-offs that we'll take to get us to the point that we need to be at. And how do we achieve interrelated aims, so things like economic regeneration, alleviation of fuel poverty, transport poverty, and how do we ensure that energy supply systems can provide or can scale up to provide what we think we need? We've all got graphs like this, I'm sure. We're all looking at things like this. And thanks to Patrick and the local the local net zero project or the local energy hubs project, we've all got strategies like this as well. So how do we turn some of this stuff into action? Lots of the targets that we have are isolated from each other. It's possible to do everything on these pages and not achieve net zero or to create a better future. It's possible to do all of these things and cause great harm potentially, I imagine, because they exist in isolated. We've treated each of the sections in an isolated way. Often these are scatter-based. I've heard scatter mentioned again today, and I think that kind of shows us how we're moving on from that sort of early days of data modelling. Some of the problems that are presented to us when we start to try and deliver these things is what are the targets based on, and how do we test them, and how do we justify them when we begin to engage stakeholders? How do we demonstrate that this is a credible evidence base to make decisions on, multi-million-pound decisions? What we're trying to achieve here, and what the hubs were set up to achieve, is a pipeline of investable projects. Are the strategies that we have in our current forms kind of taking us there? And I talk about the concept of cliff edges as well. There's a cliff edge here immediately. We do all the work to have the strategy produced, but immediately on having the strategy published, we don't immediately know how to deliver it. So we start another iteration of planning, another iteration of consultancy, and trying to understand what it is we need to take us to that pipeline approach. So what do we normally do? We commission consultants, we develop business cases, we develop PDF strategies. The standard output's the PDF report. We've got objectives, we've got targets, we translate them into action plans and business plans. We then develop projects in isolation with little sense of prioritization against a sort of matrix of what we're trying to achieve. And typically those projects are identified opportunistically, and they're based on what funding comes down the pipe. What do consultants do? This is a very simplistic diagram of what consultants do, but I'll introduce what I call the black box paradigm and the PDF paradigm here as well. So consultants will amass an evidence base of data to answer the questions that we put to them. They'll feed this, and they'll tend to keep that. They'll feed it into a model which they own, which is often proprietary and which we don't have access to. Scatter's a really good example. You know, there's a huge amount of data goes into this black box process and it spits out these targets or these things that we should do, but we don't really have insight into what's happening. We can't go in and fiddle with those models and make them into the way that we want them to work. So what we get out of the consultancy process at the moment is usually the PDF report, and that's the bit we're focused on, which is some pages with some targets and some objectives on there. We might get some spreadsheets and we might get some GIS layers if we've got the tools that we can run them on or the skills to run them internally. Often, once we've got that PDF report, to put those recommendations into action, we then need to commission more consultants to begin to develop those individual projects in more detail. What's the problem with the approach that we've got at the moment? Well, the problem is we can't really make strategy juice or business case juice. We can't somehow get a meta-analysis of all of these different disparate pieces of work that we've had done and spit them out into something that tells us what we need to do across the whole piece of net zero. We've rarely got access to the evidence base. We rarely understand or have access to the modelling. Too much proprietary software, which is the preserve of the consultants that we pay. It's impossible to harmonise the findings from those different pieces of research into a coherent plan, and it's impossible to take account of the complex interdependencies. What do we do when things change? How do we bring along other people without being able to show and demonstrate the credibility of that evidence base that we're working from for our decision making? How do we incorporate the plans of other people into our own plans? Because it's not a top-down plan that we're delivering. We don't decide how net zero will be done locally, publish our strategy, and everybody immediately sets off to work doing what we've said that they should do. Local authorities are often talk about a lack of funding, but I think in most cases, if we actually got a blank check tomorrow, we'd have to confess that we also don't often have a plan. What would we immediately do with that blank check in terms of retrofit? What's the first house we retrofit and why? Do we know where that is and what we're going to do? So often we've got these strategies, we've got these plans, but they're not at that granular on-street level of exactly what we're going to do. Also, net zero is not going to be delivered by Patrick, sort of, and money coming down the funding pipeline. We're increasingly, the principle of the net zero project was that we would develop these pipelines of investable projects which existed separate from government funding. We wouldn't only respond to government funding. We would go out and find ways to fund these solutions ourselves. So it's important that we don't only respond to funding, we work out how to solve the whole problem in a way that's agnostic to funding, and we then begin to work out how to fund this. So the right projects will find the right routes to funding, or we can become instrumental in developing those right routes to funding rather than leaving central government with the problem to solve. You know, it's easy to criticise, but like Patrick said, you know, there's a lack of evidence. There's a lack of evidence being provided back into central government around the type of problems that we've got and how we think that we could solve them. So to me at the moment, the outcome is all in the wrong place. We're developing the evidence, the modelling exists, but we don't own any of it, and we're having to pay to have access to it every time. So just a very quick look at strategy. The first point in a strategy, we tend to try and understand the world right now. We create the world in data, but we only revisit it every 10 years. So we tend to look at the policy background, we amass a load of data, we sort of take the pulse of whatever the thing is we're trying to look at, but we only look at it at that one point. How can we make that a dynamic process? So how do we turn the diagram on the left into the diagram on the right? So it's a constant evolving process. And I think, like what Andrew was talking about, this is some of what local area energy planning looks to do. And as well, what Lizzie's talked about. in the distribution future energy scenarios. It's a way of creating this kind of living model instead. So it's having a dynamic process. I think it's like setting off walking and taking a compass bearing and then just not checking that compass again ever, as you begin to veer away from your course, because the world's changing around us. It isn't sufficient to only visit these complex problems once every 10 years or so. So how do we develop models which can account for interdependencies and allow for us to update them? Well, we look at work that other people have done, which is good, and we steal it. So there are great examples of this being done. I've really enjoyed future energy scenarios since I first became familiar with that in about 2015 or 2016, I think. So a fantastic example of planning for uncertainty. Also on there is the distribution future energy scenarios, and this is an EV specific tool that Transport for the North have developed, but this is the EVCI framework. Again, very similar tools. They're visualizations with underlying models, and they're scenario based. They're temporal in that they allow for the visualization of different pathways over time. So you take a set of scenarios, you take points in time between now and a set place in the future, 2040, 2050, and you can see how those different scenarios play out using different sections, different sectors, and understand the interrelation between large disparate chunks of data and different interventions. So the key takeaways from what we've learned looking at the models that are out there is that they are digital, first and foremost. They're spatial, based on GIS data, mapped to the most granular level available. And I think I hear a bit of sort of data speak creeping in today. So just when we talk about granular, what we're talking about is the highest resolution possible. So if you are looking at retrofit, you don't just want LSOA, you want houses. You want to know individually as far as possible. You want the data. You want the desk-based analysis to take you as far as possible into the project development and identification. These tools are temporal, so they allow us to project forward in time and understand what will happen, or to work backwards from an end point. And now, this is another big gap in our strategies. What our strategies don't take account of and what our pathways don't take account of is all of the things we haven't done. Because every day we don't do something, what we have to do gets bigger. So the strategy makes it look like we've got these nice, comfortable outcomes and we can just gradually chip away at those. But actually, the way our carbon budgets work is that our inaction means we have to do more and we have to do it faster. So simply delivering that 10-year strategy isn't going to achieve what your carbon budget needs you to achieve, because of you're going to have to scale up for every year that you don't do anything. And I don't think that message is probably getting through to our elected members. These models are easily engaged with by stakeholders, and that's massive. So something like distribution future energy scenarios and the way that Northern Power Grid run their stakeholder workshops. Once you've got this up and running, you begin to engage with other actors locally, and you begin to bring in other people's plans, and you begin to feed what you understand to be other people's pathways within your local area into this plan as well. So you're then going from this kind of your plan of uncertainty begins to get more certain once you understand the activities that other actors have in their plans as well. One of the things that we talked about, I think it was in Lizzie's, was about some of the work that they're doing about EV uptake. When you have a forecast, you can go out to other people that also have forecasts and say, well, how did you do yours? We can calibrate models against each other, and we can begin to, it's like gambling, it's like trying to develop a system where we get better at predicting the outcomes using the best available modeling. And it's open by default. What we're trying to do is create data systems that we can open up to stakeholders, that we can open up to anyone that wants them, and we can allow people access to the data. So if we've got a problem to solve, we can allow access to that data. So say to the private sector, we can turn these into challenges. If we've got renewables that we're looking for, if we're looking for investment, we can frame these in a model and we can open them up for investment challenges. So just want to cover the LEAP methodology briefly. I'm not suggesting that this is something different to the LEAP methodology or is a revision to the LEAP methodology necessarily, but is complementary. There are a couple of problems with the LEAP methodology at the moment which have kind of led us down this path in the first place. And that's just that to some extent it's still based in that kind of black box or magic 8-ball kind of paradigm of like, we don't really know how it works, it just tells us the answer. And it's still based in the PDF paradigm a bit as well. So we know Energy Systems Catapult have access to all the GIS tools, they've got access to the spreadsheet tools, the modelling, but the client is getting a kind of PDF report which summarises some of that, but it's not where the real magic of the process is. So at the moment, I say the reason why the weather forecast's on there again, you know, I'll labour the point somewhat, but it's like printing off the weather forecast for the year. After a couple of weeks, it's just not going to be worth much in terms of telling you whether you're going to get wet that day or not. So the idea, you know, it's nice to have a weather forecast for the month, but you would still check it every couple of days just to make sure that it was still accurate. What happens with those current processes when something changes? What happens with your local area energy plan? Say, for example, when the zero emission vehicles end date gets moved by 5 years, what do you do? Well, you have to go back to the person that owns that model and you have to ask them to rerun it, and you have to pay for that again. If you owned that model yourself, or you owned that process yourself, or you already had, you know, the writing was on the wall, you could have developed a scenario and you could have had it ready to go. So you could say, well, yeah, when you get asked that question internally, what do we do now? You say, well, we already know what to do because we worked that out. We could see this coming. So it's not an alternative to LEAP. It's more about changing the focus and the outputs to give more decision-making power to the authority. So is there a solution, and what is it? We think there is, but it's not quite there at the moment. So there is an emerging software as a service sector supported with data expertise to support development of detailed digital models of cities and regions. And this is based in something called digital twinning. So anyone who works in built environment might know about digital twinning for at campus level or specific building level. It's creating a virtual simulation of how a building should operate, and then understanding the gap between the real operation of the building. What we're now seeing is that those digital archetypes of what we know how buildings will run are enabling us to digitally model whole cities or whole regions and understand more. We're bringing in different layers as well around our energy networks and such as well. So a couple of examples that are out there in the real world is the RESOP project that Advanced Infrastructure have done with Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, and Integrated Environmental Solutions, or IES Limited, who I know are now working with Calderdale on their LEAP as well. On the right, that's a screenshot from their system as well. And I think that, sorry, I haven't moved this on. I think that's Gateshead. So the temporal modelling element of this is not that well understood. We know that we've got the visual representations out there. The temporal modelling is more complex, and it's a very young field that's only just developing, really. So there's a key role for ourselves to identify and work with suppliers to help suppliers to understand what we need so that suppliers can then deliver it. And that's what we're doing with the STEM project. So this is a hub-funded project. So the project will establish the evidence for need, both in terms of national policy, which is top-down, and from the combined authorities and hubs and local authorities, which is bottom-up. We'll examine the commercial sector and their ability to respond. You know, in short, do the things that we think that we want actually exist, and where can we get them from? How much are they going to cost? How many people do they take to run? Where do we get the skills? Do those skills already exist? Do those resources already exist? Where do we put those resources? Are they at local authority? Are they at combined authority? Are they at Net Zero Hub? And we make recommendations for what's next. I'm already involved in one of the UKRI projects working with Advanced Infrastructure. We, as the hubs, are looking to, we've bid into UKRI Pathfinder Places 2, which is an opportunity to work with a supplier to start to refine the available systems and have some resource that we can dedicate to this too. And it's fair to say we've had a lot of interest in this project from consultants and commercial organisations that are interested in working with us. So it does seem that we're kind of on the crest of something a little bit here. But yeah, hopefully that's been really useful in terms of kind of defining the problem and trying to explain what it is we're trying to give you. The outputs of the STEM project will be out before the end of the financial year, and we'll share those through the Hub network, so you'll have access to our findings as well. If anyone's interested, I'm around for lunch, do have to leave. Get in touch with me outside of this as well. If you've got any thinking around this at all, I'd love to hear about it, because it's a really good opportunity now to kind of incorporate anyone's stories or anything else, experiences, into the report that we do. Thanks for listening, everyone.